So Dan, this was only a couple days ago. So, and this talk is not. I mean, I had to look at it carefully because when I talk to the team, I'm talking to potential captains, and I'm helping them select captains and giving them, like I frame it, I'm going to give you some qualities that I think are captain-like. And then you look amongst the group you're in and say, does this person model those qualities? And if the answer is yes, then that's a good consideration for a captain. So that's kind of the framework. This is different here because I said, well, you're not selecting captains, are you? And he says, well, no. And he says, but it's still good stuff. I said, okay, let me take a look and let me kind of frame it better so that it orients to your group. So I'm thinking, okay, what would we call this? And it's just organizational leadership, or community leadership is another way. And what I mean when I say organizational or community is any group of people that have a common mission, okay? So if you have a group of people with a common mission, you're going to have some organizational hierarchy involved in that. Just by nature, if you all were in, everybody's a leader, but when you say that, you're like, no, that person's different than me because that person is actually the CEO of the company. That's a different type of leader, but you're all leaders. But you get what I say. There's somebody that has to have the control of the wheel, and then there's other people that have to make sure that there's gas in the car and make sure there's a oil in the car, and collectively the car runs well. So that's what I talk about with the organizational hierarchy. So somebody here is going to be kind of driving the car, and doesn't mean they're better or worse than anybody, but you have to say yes and no to somebody, or else you're all going in different directions. Okay, so let's talk about leadership in terms of organizational hierarchy or community leadership. And then let's go back to Galatians, which I thought was interesting because I know we're in that right now and kind of the week to week. My first step is, well, let's go back and let's look at Galatians holistically, and let's kind of, in my own mind, figure out what I think is said. And I always think it's interesting because I'm not a theologian, but I'm a lawyer trained, so I kind of care about the words as they're written. And it's hard because they're translated. So I look at Galatians and I go, okay, what have we been told? We know it's Paul, and we know Paul's writing to a community and saying, guys, you got some things going on. You're living by, I guess, gospel 2.0, and there's no 2.0, and that's a problem, and that's like the Jesus plus. And then I look and say, okay, now what does Paul talk about when he sorts out that, hey, you guys, you're going astray. You're doing something that you're not being asked to do, or doing more than you're being asked to do. And then it seems to me then Paul kind of shifts and says, what would it look like on a personal level then if you're living according to gospel 1.0, okay? And that's when he talks about in step with the Spirit, through the Spirit, and all that, which is really cool. And then you get to the very end, which is where I'm at, Galatians 6, and he's like, now what's it look like when you're living amongst a community of like-minded people on a common mission? What does that look like? And I think that's Galatians 6. So this church has a mission. A business might have a mission. I was the managing partner of our law firm for a lot of the years, almost half the years I was there. So we had a mission, and those missions may be different, but the leadership qualities may be similar in that sense. So that's kind of the look I'm going through. So I'm going to read Galatians 6 first to us all, and I have the ESV version because I was told by my pastor that that's the most literal translation. And since I care about words, I don't know ancient Greek, so I figured, well, this is as good as I'm going to get for now until someone tells me what these words mean. And then you'll see when I look at these words, I go, oh, wait, they use the same word, but then they use a different word following it. Something must be up here. So then that makes me think a little bit. Anyway, so I'll read it, and then I'll come back to it. So, brothers, if anyone is caught in transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reasons to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor, for each will have to bear his own load. Let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially those who are of the household of faith. Okay, some of that you need to know what was said before to understand what was said right now, which is fine. And when I talk to the football team, I don't go back to like Galatians 5 and that and explain what he's talking about when he says spirit and what he's talking about when he says some other things. I will briefly here, though, because I think it's important to kind of understand. So I'm going to break it down. And I think what's interesting about Paul is that his message seems like a weave. And sometimes he has themes that are woven once another. And if I were editing it, I might rearrange things slightly different, but I don't have that luxury of editing it, but I do right now. Okay. So I'm going to rearrange things slightly different because I'm going to pull 3 themes out related to leadership and 3 themes out related to, I guess, I struggled with what to call it because it's like, well, there's a leader and then there's a receiver of the leadership message. I think a teammate. Maybe we'll just say a teammate. And in the teammate perspective, you move between teammate to leader and leader to teammate. So you can think of sometimes I'm in this position, other times in this position. So they may relate to both of you. Interestingly, I think the first paragraph relates to the leadership qualities, and the second paragraph I'm going to relate to the teammate qualities. So the title, which was not, this was added, bear one another's burden, that comes from the words here too, which I thought was interesting. So first, and this is not in the same order as it was written, like I say. So Paul wrote, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. I started from there because I thought that's the starting place for this whole chapter right here. And when you think about, well, what do you mean when you say bear one another's burdens? And really, he could interject the word service right there. So he's talking about you need to lead from a place of service for others. And that's the starting place. But then there's this, if you didn't read before, you wouldn't know what this means, because then he says, so fulfill the law of Christ. And then if you go back, I think it's chapter 5, he defines what the law of Christ is. And so he says, chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. And he did talk about that as well, I think in chapter 5 too, what kind of those fleshly urges that you have and why those lead you astray and why you need to have your focus on the Spirit. Then he says, but through love, serve one another. So that's where you get this idea, okay, bear one another's burden. He's talking about service right there. For the whole law is fulfilled on one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's what he's talking about when he says fulfill the law of Christ. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. So the first bullet point is that a leader serves through a foundation of love. Okay, that would be the first bullet point I'd put there. And I chose it, and I know the ordering slightly out of order as that he went, but I think that we need to start there to understand how to do the next part, okay? So then the next part I jump to, it says, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgressions, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Now, I don't know exactly what Paul was probably talking about, those fleshly transgressions that he was talking about before, and maybe, hey, if you're in a leadership position, then you can do something about it. But I think what's really important is that last word, gentleness. And this, I think, is the hardest part that a leader has to deal with, is how do I lead and how do I get the mission and the people involved in this mission-driven, I guess, this route that we're heading in the same direction when people start to go astray or people just aren't doing their share of it. And there's different ways. You can think of the leader who leads through fear, and it's very persuasive, and it works. If you say, hey, if you don't do this, you're going to get the belt or something like that. Guess what? The person's going to do it, but they're not going to do it for the right reasons, and it's not going to be long-lasting. So I think the gentleness is going to that perspective. How do you restore? Put them back on the right path, right? Bring them back to the mission-oriented goal that we have in mind. So two of my mentors in coaching and in kind of leadership, one Dan mentioned was Frosty. His big motto was make the big time where you are. And I kind of take a look at that and say, if you're in a mission of like-minded people, that's your big time, okay? So you need to play that role in your big time for that moment. And the other one was John Wooden, and he has his pyramid of success. If you don't know, look it up. But his pinnacle is the definition of success, and it's really just comparing yourself to your potential, your God-given abilities. I'll talk about that in a second. But those are the two mentors. So Frosty used to then talk about this concept of tough love, and I think that's the gentleness that is being talked about here. That's the way Frosty would have described it, that to be able to restore, you can use that loving, but it's tough love. You're fair, but you're firm. So you're not, some people like to sugarcoat things and tell you, oh, it's okay. No. But if you do it with a fair, firm, and loving approach, the person on the other end will understand that comes from a good place, and it doesn't come from, I'm a militant, dictator that just demanding this production out of you. And then maybe we all work together for this common mission that we have. So that would be called tough love. I don't know, you've probably heard it. They don't know how much you know until they know how much you care. And that kind of is that same concept there of, that's the restoration that I think Paul's talking about. Now, from salvation purposes, if you have another Christian that's going astray, they're saying, you need to go and help bear their burden so that you can serve and get them on the right path through this gentle love. And as a leader in an organization, you can do the same too. You can do the same. So I think the second prong, remember, is 3. This is the second one. A leader restores others with gentleness. Okay? And in the third part, this is a big part here. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load. And I thought about that a lot. And there's a lot of there. And I thought, okay, it's really a warning. It's a warning to us, or caution to us. A caution might be a better word than warning. It's a caution. I think it's cautioning us about kind of this prideful, egocentric, boastful living. And it's telling you, more than that, it's more of a call to action too. And he uses the word test, but I think, and I don't know what the Greek translation of the word is, but I thought maybe an assessment might be a better. I'm assessing myself, versus myself, not versus what, and this is easy in a team concept like football, versus what last year's team did, good or bad, versus what this person on this team did, good or bad. I'm not taking credit for that. That's the wrong assessment, or that's the wrong test. I need to test myself against what my best self is, or what my potential is. Frosty would have called that your performance gap. Am I closing that gap, or am I here? And you got to be honest and truthful with yourself. Does you no good to say, well, gosh, how am I doing as compared to that person? That's not going to help you much, because you're not that person. So I think it's a cautionary tale about that, and really assessing your own self. But I think the words that I thought I locked onto the most were at the very end. For each will have to bear his own load. And I thought, okay, bear one another's burdens. But he doesn't use the word burden here. He used the word load here. And I don't know what the Greek is again. And I'm a lawyer trained, so I say, well, there must be a difference between burden and load. Because if it meant burden, he would say burden. If he meant load, he would say load in both places. So what's the difference? And I think, well, in this case, the difference has to be the fact that the self-assessment relates to something that is internal within you and external from everyone else, that you're unique and different, and you have different strengths and different weaknesses, and those are God-given to you. And that burden is the service you do for others, and the load is what your potential is. So you're really assessing yourself upon what God gave you, that load God gave you, the load God gave you. So is it, and that includes your strengths and weaknesses. So you self-assess what I am capable of, and then measure it in that sense. And then I think here you go, and I got to qualify some things here, because the whole basis of faith is not Acts or Jesus plus and all that. And you say, well, what are you talking about now? Because now you're talking about maybe you're falling into this trap of Acts. Well, I'm not talking about salvation right now, even though it's can be related. I'm talking about an organization's drive towards a mission, okay? And that does require acts, okay? Because if we all just sat here and say, well, this is a great mission, and we sat here all day like this, guess what would happen? Nothing. So you might have your salvation because your heart might be pure, and you may have that correct and stuff, but the mission will not be furthered. So I think there's a difference there in that sense. And I do think there's a difference, too, in understanding, like, the person who keeps the checklist of the good deeds they make during the day versus the person who just does good deeds because they're driven by the Spirit. If you look at them on paper, you may say these are the same people, but the heart's in the different places, okay? So you get the double win if you're driven by the Spirit and you do the acts because the Spirit drives you to do those acts. I got one more. Okay, this is related to this too, okay? This is related to this. That last paragraph. So it's assessing yourself and self-assessment of yourself. So how do I define that and break it down into one bullet point? The leader models the mission. So a leader serves others through a foundation built on love. A leader models the mission, and a leader restores others with gentleness. That's the order I put them in. That's not the order Paul put them in. Paul kind of weaved them together. But I put them in this order because I don't know that you can restore with gentleness unless you're doing the other two. So that's why I put them in this order. Okay, so that's the first paragraph. Okay, so now we're on verses 6 through 10. Okay, so now I read these and I immediately said, when we're talking about more than just leadership qualities, we're talking about teammate qualities in addition to leadership qualities. And it starts with, let the one who taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. And I had to read that like 3 times. And I said, who's teaching whom? And who's getting taught and what? And so I looked real carefully and it says, the one who has taught. Okay, so let the one who has taught the word is taught the word, not the one who taught the word. So that's the one receiving the message of the teacher. So the one receiving some leadership, the one being restored in gentleness, or not necessarily restored, but maybe just guided, in gentleness. So I think that's simple. You just have to be open to instruction. You have to be open to that instruction. So that gentle restoration that Paul talks about in the other paragraph. So a teammate's open to instruction. So if you're not acting as a leader at that moment and someone's instructing you through gentleness, be open to it. Then you get into the next part. Let the one who has taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that will be also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Okay, now there's the salvation perspective, and we know what the Spirit means and what Paul's talking about, and then there's the organizational leadership. I think when you look at this in an organizational leadership perspective, you can kind of inject for Spirit mission, okay? And you can say, well, the one who sows the mission reaps the benefits of the mission in that sense, in sense of they're actually furthering the mission that we all agreed is worth furthering. So share all good things with one who has led. So if you look back up, share the load that you've been God-given. Use those tools that you've been given for the benefit of the mission. It's a call to action from the teammate perspective, just like Paul called to action the leader to restore in gentleness. You're being called to now carry out those things toward the mission if you're a teammate. So a teammate needs to bear their own load as well. A teammate should use their gifts for the furtherance of the mission to the best of their ability. And then that reminds me of John Wooden's definition of success, and it kind of gives you a benchmark, is that peace of mind you get when you know you've done everything you can to be the best you're capable. And you can look up, I paraphrase it, he gets a little clunky in his words. Sorry, Mr. Wooden. But it's really it's a self-assessed definition of success, and probably one of the only ones you can really. It's biblical. He was very biblical and very strong in his faith, just as Frosty was too. So that guided him in kind of his pyramid of success and how he defines it. What's important to know, though, is that each piece of this team, as a teammate, has a purpose and a value that's needed, because it wouldn't exist if it wasn't needed. So at some point, someone assessed globally and said, what do we need to carry out this mission? Well, we need this, we need that, we need it from a team, we need a quarterback, we need an offensive lineman that includes these, we need that. And if we don't have this, we're going to not carry out the mission to the best of our capability, because we're going to miss a critical component. And the leadership's role is to ensure that you understand the value and worth that you have towards the success of the organization. That kind of goes back, make the big time where you are. So your big time is whatever role you're in, whether you're, you're changing paper towels out, or whether you're preaching on Sunday. Yeah, it doesn't mean you're not important. You just have a different piece to the puzzle. And if that puzzle's missing, then it's not going to work. So when you understand that, then I can break it down into what one of our old coaches, Dan, had this coach too. He just defined what you're supposed to do as your job. Do your job. It's that easy, because your job was important enough to have it there. And if it's not done, we're gonna fail, or we're not going to be as successful as our mission. So teammates need to do the job to the best of their ability. So do your job is another way to say that. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially those who are of the household of faith. I think he has that last part. He's just like, hey, don't forget the ones that you're with. Don't forget the ones you're working with right here, because they're special, because they're bought into this common mission, which is really, I think, the theme of this whole thing. Whenever you're in a mission, you're going to have your ups and downs, and you're going to have your struggles, and that's what I think he's getting at when he says, "Do not give up." But I think the heart of it is to be a good teammate and to be a good mission-driven community. You have to have a strong belief in what you're doing, and if you don't, you shouldn't be a part of it. We always, in football, it's like everyone plays football for different reasons, and sometimes it's parents, sometimes it's I want to look like I'm cool at school or whatever, and those are interesting reasons, but not the right reasons, if that's the case. Just like everyone chooses their occupation for different reasons. Sometimes it's, hey, I got to pay the bills, and that's noble, and that might be true for the moment. But if you have the opportunity, in the end, you want to get to something that actually you believe in and is worth doing, whether you're paid or not paid. It's how you spend your time, So, and then you get paid, and you get to buy food, and even better, So I think it's that belief in the mission is what is being talked about here, and don't lose that enthusiastic spirit to carry out the mission, because that'll help you drive to do the acts that are necessary so that the mission's further. Again, this is not salvation talk. This is organizational leadership and success of an organization talk. Although I think that if you stay in step with the Spirit, then you become more enthusiastic, and you tend to do the things that, you see somebody and say, that guy's spirited. Why do you know that? Well, I just see the way they do things, and hopefully they're not checking boxes off, hoping that they're getting, bankrolled to get salvation. They're doing it because they're filled with the Spirit. A teammate believes in the mission and is enthusiastic, steadfast, in support of the mission. Okay, so I'm going to read those three in the order I think I would order them if I were Paul. Not that Paul did it wrong, it's just Paul, I think, weaves everything together, because I think that last one is the starting place. So a teammate believes in the mission, is enthusiastically steadfast in support of the mission. Second one, a teammate does their job to the best of their ability. And then finally, a teammate is open to instruction. So those are the big three in terms of leadership, the big three in terms of being a teammate or an employee, whatever you want to call it, a member of a team. But I thought Galatians 6 did a really good job. When we talk to the captains, we talk about some of those qualities and kind of weave them in sense of selecting captains and let them do it. But I think Dan was right that it transcends and can carry on to kind of organizational leadership. Okay, so a leader serves others through a foundation built on love. Okay, a leader models the mission. Okay, a leader restores others with gentleness. A teammate believes in the mission and is enthusiastically steadfast in support of the mission. A teammate does their job to the best of their ability. And then finally, a teammate is open to instruction. But that's the hardest, I think, as a leader, is how do this person's astray for whatever their mission is, and how do I go about the restoration or correction, but without, because people don't like to be told they're not doing something, in the right. But how do you do it? And that's the trick, and that's the hardest part. And I think you have to create a foundation from which they know you're coming from the right heart, and then they can accept that. Oh, this person's not doing it because they just want this for themselves in the end. If I do this more, then it's going to help them in the end. They're doing out of more than that. And I think that's what when I talk to the selection of captains, it's like, you have to think about those qualities. And those qualities don't happen. Like, if someone off the street comes up to me, it's harder to accept that from somebody that I don't know, because I don't know. They haven't earned, I guess, you don't know that the trust and you don't know the source from which their comments are being generated from yet. And I think that's the problem, is that as a leader, you have to invest that amount of time so that people know your heart and where you're coming from, so that then they'll listen rather than just do for the wrong reasons. Because you can influence behavior lots of ways, and you can get results lots of ways, but you want to get the results through a way that furthers your mission in the long run too. Again, I'm no theologian. I'm just a guy who's lived amongst people that want certain things done that I think are noble, and we do them together, and we think, well, this book helps you in those respects. So you just apply it in a different setting. So so there's things like, I'll just use a basic, simple example of a kid in a drill that continually does something wrong. and maybe you've casually commented on it, and then you notice this happening, and you start getting frustrated. It's like, is this kid defying me on purpose? I've told them how to do this, and so there's some correction and restoration that's needed, and you have a route you can go. You can publicly shame them, or you can approach it differently and maybe do it out of the presence of other people, and so that they understand, rather, because maybe they didn't understand your correction the first time, and you're like, hey, you had to do it this way, and if you choose the public shaming, that might not be in a spirit of gentleness. So that would be an example. Maybe the better route would be is take the opportunity to pull them aside and say, hey, I've been watching your drills. I don't know if you heard when I talked to you about this, but let's get this corrected because I want you to be at your best. And I think that this might affect that, So that would be an example of a way. So some leaders would take the opportunity to yell and scream and just berate a kid unnecessarily. Now that said, there are times that in a community that maybe the community needs to be shaken up a little bit. One of the rules I thought Frosty instilled, which is probably important for us, and I think when these people talk about, don't write the email and send it immediately when you're, but Frosty, after a game, win or lose, we didn't lose that much, but if we did, we had one that was brutal loss my junior year, but he would never confront a team's errors the night of the game, after the game. Because in his mind, he says, everyone's way too emotional. It's not going to do any good. Wait until you come back after you've had some time to reflect, and then we can figure out really what happened and how we can correct the issue. So I took that advice and thought that was really appropriate for him. And thinking back, he never did. Win or lose after the game, it was similar. I mean, it seemed the same. And this was my junior year. We got beat by 30 points to a Southern Oregon team with a running back that had over 300 yards rushing. It was insane. But Frosty, you wouldn't know we lost. In fact, all he did is congratulate the running back for how good he was, which was appropriate. He was really good that day. We were going through a lot of changes that year. Like, we changed defensive schemes, and I'm sure Frosty was thinking to himself, what are we doing? This is not working. This is crazy. But to his credit, it wouldn't have helped us to just kind of rip into us at that moment. And we made corrections, and that next year is the year we won the national championship. I mean, our hearts didn't change. We wanted to do the same. We just weren't executing yet. And Frosty was wise enough to know that's not appropriate. That would do more damage than good at that time. So in his sense, the gentleness at that moment was just letting things be and letting the process play out, because he knew that we were driven by his defensive coordinator, that he had a mission and a plan that was just took a little bit of time to sort itself. So, which I think give credibility to that mission and that program, which was very much like a gospel-driven football program, that it shouldn't matter if you're doing things for the right purpose. Maybe that team was just way better than you, But as long as you're doing the things you're doing to the best of your ability, then you can live with the consequence of what happened. And that didn't mean we didn't strive to get better and try to say, if we did it again, we would have done it this way. So if we have that opportunity again, here's what we'll do different, But he added what he called an afterglow, and it was a community. It was the broader community of players, coaches, and family members that would get together and share the game's experience, and stories of that, win or lose. I mean, there was always good things that happen, even if you lose, and talk about it. And it was never somber. It didn't seem somber to me. Frosty was good with repetition. He had his stories of explaining his philosophy about this more than winning or more than champions type philosophy. More than champions was the big overarching theme of the program. Romans, more than champions.
Okay.
So, and champion he would define as someone who is cares more than just the ultimate outcome, but cares more about the journey and the process, and trying to strive for them to reach their own potential, which is back to John. Frosty's mentors were Wooden and Lombardi, because Lombardi coached the Packers, but Frosty would have to use a lot of like mental gymnastics to get Lombardi. Lombardi was what was his big quote? It's the only thing. So Frosty, he didn't mean that, guys. He meant the desire to win. So he'd have to do some mental gymnastics. So, but it was funny. But he was the coach of the time. So those were the two. But Wooden really, I think, drove his actual philosophy of And I think Lombardi's success kind of attracted him in the sense that he had systems and plans to enact and gain that success, which allowed that team to get to the best of their ability too. So, so I think Frosty's steadfast repetition on the in not wavering on that is what he did. That said, I think Frosty, and this may be true with organizations as well, and I think it is true, that not everybody's fit to be a part of that mission. And I'm not talking about ultimate salvation. I'm talking about if your mission is a law firm and your mission is to serve your clients and try to recover for them for whatever wrong had been done to them for others, there's people that aren't going to fit that mission. And they shouldn't be there in that case. And Frosty would have been the first to tell you that this place may be for some, but not all. And that's okay. You know, they may have a different desire and a different driven. And I think that gets back to where I was talking about as a teammate, that you need to be enthusiastically driven for the mission that you chose to be a part of, or you shouldn't be a part of it. Now, there are kids that went to PLU that probably were not PLU Frosty kids at the beginning, and they were by the end. So they made the choice and they bought in. So, but I think of like organizations, I think our door's open, but once you get in, you're a part of us now. And if you don't want to be part of us, you're going to go out the back door. You know, and that doesn't mean you don't care and you don't want them to be, but ultimately you gotta decide what's important for your mission. And so when we traveled, you would go as a team. What you're talking about is we get on an airplane, and then the flight staff do their silly stuff that they like, bring out the mask and so everybody started just mimicking the flight staff people and what they're doing, in addition to actually greeting them and saying hello to them. But by the end of the flight staff people don't feel like they're working anymore. They're part of this thing, and they're excited about their job now because they've been valued, I guess is all they can say. They feel like they had a meaning and a place, and they recognized what they were doing was appreciated as well. We used to go up to Canada. We would play a team in Canada, and it was always a struggle getting across the border. We couldn't do it now probably, but we played Simon Fraser, and we're on our way back. We'd always stop at the same restaurant, and Frosty loved to like give cheers for the cooks and stuff. And he's like, this meal was the best meal we've ever had, right, guys? And let's give Walter back there. Hey, Walter, go Walter, that away. And then he turns to and he goes, and then let's give the owners here. They're the best people. You know, we've been coming here for years and years. Let's give them a cheer. And he goes, all right. And his wife's Donna. What's her name, Donna? But you know, he did that. So we used to meet as captains. This is funny though. We used to meet as captains. There was 5 of us at that time. And he would weekly meet with us and kind of get a pulse of the team, which a good leader does too. We don't want to be caught off guard, and like we want to catch these issues before they get too ripe so we can correct them and stuff. So he'd meet with us and he'd talk and how we doing, what any of the issues that you see coming up, how do you feel us as coaches are doing, stuff like that. He's receiving feedback. So he's asking us to be a leader to him at that moment in time. Well, then at the end we get around and we pray, and he's like, Lord, thank you for these 5 captains, that let us have a great remaining part of the season. I specifically want to thank Judd and Anthony and Jeremy. And then you could tell he got caught. He couldn't remember one of the names. So he's sitting there and he's like, he goes, Lord, help me. And then John, who he forgot, goes, John. He goes, thank you, Lord. So you knew John Nelson. He had arthroglyph something, which meant all his joints were locked up. So he was in a wheelchair. So his story, and this was before my time. He came to PLU, and he came from Singapore, was kind of trashed by his parents and left to die, and then he got into kind of a home at Singapore and was somehow adopted by a family, but then they didn't treat him very well. He says they treated him like garbage. So they did surgeries on him to fuse his joints in such a way that he could move, but he could not move his joints. So he was able to control an electric wheelchair with his one hand, and he had a stick with the other hand. So everything had to be done for him. So he could not feed himself. He could not, but with the wheelchair he could move around. So that's about all he could do. So he apparently he went through a program at PLU, but had a terrible experience with his family. Was not doing well at PLU according to him. This was before my time. said he was contemplating suicide, in his dorm, ran into a football player who invited him to a game. He went to the game. After the game, they lost. Okay. They lost the game. And then he heard like announce, hey, the Afterglow is going to be in the field house after the game. Everybody's invited. So he went to the Afterglow expecting this team that is really good that had just lost, expecting to hear some downers. And what he heard was not, it was exactly what I was telling you. Is like he described it as, I didn't know who won and lost. It didn't matter. So from that moment, he got up and spoke. He felt compelled enough to speak and said, I was going to kill myself. And then I came here and saw that there's something more to my life, even in the condition I am, and you all don't feel sorry for me. So he was part of the team for since, and that was mid 80s, I believe, late 80s. So he was part of the team. 99 is when I graduated. And he kind of led an interesting role because a lot of the young people would kind of take him. He lived in a nursing home at that time, but he spent his days at PLU, and he had to be managed by essentially the freshman football players that came in, kind of took him in and cared for him, even though he was, 20 years older than them or 15 years older than them. They took him in and cared for him. But here's the story, because Frosty's not without his issues too. Okay, so my senior year, we were going to go down and play Cal Lutheran our very first game. And for some reason, John, who had traveled with us on a lot of the away games and stuff, was not going to travel with us and come down with us. And we were flying. And it was upsetting a lot of the people. So the captains decided, we got to talk to Frosty about this and see what's going on. So then Frosty, we met with him and we said, Frosty, John's not coming on the trip. A lot of people are questioning what's up because John has come to other things. And he says, well, I'm just concerned he's too much of a distraction for people. And he's thinking like a coach. He's like, if our mission is to put the best product out there, I don't want to have my kids that are on the travel team have to worry about taking him to the bathroom, feeding him. They should be, they should have a clear mind, not worrying about how John's doing and whatnot. And then I just remember talking to him, and I told him, I said, but Frost, you don't understand. He's a member of the team. He's part of the team. We see him that way. So if there's anything we can do, he needs to be with us. And then by the end of that year, he was made an honorary head coach. Not head coach, but honorary coach of the team. And it was kind of a part of the program. If you watch our national championship game, they did a little deal on him in his cart right there. But I think even leaders, I think that's the thing that leaders need to be open to, restoration and instruction and kind of that. Because I think Frosty kind of saw it and goes, oh, yeah, you're right. It's more of a distraction if he's not here than him being here, because now he's part of us and he's part of this team differently than he had been in the past. And I think it was because for whatever reason, he became really, really close with some of the guys on the team differently than he had been before. And not just in outside of football, but included in football. But I always remember Frosty's reaction. It wasn't like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. You're wrong. He just listened. And then he says, no, you're right. He needs to be a part of us. And so every single game we played, like I told you, we played, I think it was 4 airplane trip games in 4 weeks. And he was on every single one. So by the end, without question, it wasn't even a question.